Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the finale of the Kindergarten Chats, but not quite, because we're going to, after this is the final 2 chapters of the main book. And then we're going to do 2 series of meetups, 2 meetups on the essays that are behind this. You know, Sherri, who knows this very well, insisted that we had to go through those. It won't be complete without it. So we're going to do those 2 after this. So the structure today is we're going to start, as always, with our peers. So we're going to start with Sherri and end with Rupali. And then we've got Maritza and Joia as this part. And then we've got Rob in the middle as the keystone. So that's the structure. Let's start with Sherri.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I love these last 2 chapters. They're very, very exciting. And I have a slideshow. So Shrikant, we can share screen, right? Okay. And I just have a couple of lines here to read before we jump into the slideshow. And what I love about this part is, and it just happens to be, I don't know if you know this, Rob, it happens to be graduation weekend here in Charlottesville, which is always a big, big event. The whole town gets, well, usually shut down.
For University of Virginia.
UVA has this big, very elaborate, absolutely fantastic graduation ceremony where you get to walk the lawn. I myself got to do that a number of years ago. It's quite a delight, although today it is
hot.
94. So they're sweating out there in their black gowns.
That's about how hot it was when you did it.
Yeah, I know, I did. It was. So, but there's always this sense of graduation and venturing out into a whole new start. And that is what really comes across in this chapter on optimism. And I love the second paragraph here where he says, "We have arrived close to the ending of your primary education and the beginning of your new self-creative education, for our talks in parts have been but kindergarten chats." Always one of my favorites. But what I want to do is I want to talk about how what happens after Louis Sullivan, what effect his work had on architecture going forth. So I'll start with a couple of last thoughts that he gives to his student. And he talks here about remember, above all, not only that your art starts with utility, but that the foundation of utility is the sole foundation and guarantee of its expression in your hands into the beautiful. It lies with you to demonstrate the thoroughgoing value of optimism as imagined in results, as imaged in results, excuse me. So remember that bear ever in mind in your thinking and your doings, that form ever follows function, that this is the law, a universal truth, that the main function, so far as you will be concerned, will focus in the specific needs of those who wish to build, and that such needs are quite apt to be emotional as well as what is so generally called practical. That your share will be to investigate and assimilate those needs with the utmost care to find in the problem, which in the aggregate they form, a true solution, and then to express in truthful terms, in satisfying beautiful forms, a creative impulse which shall conserve and not suppress. And then I'm going to jump to, and I know I have a very strong suspicion that someone else on the panel is going to come to this line again, but it's so good, we're going to repeat it. So going to the very last couple lines. So we shall, or so shall we will in the springtime. It is our time for willing. Now begin. So let's do our screen share and that for you.
Where's share screen?
Share screen.
And I always get confused here. Sullivan 9. Here we show Sullivan 9.
All right.
And then hit
Play.
if I can. It's covering up.
All right. So as most of you know, one of the first places that Louis Sullivan's ideas show up in after, can you move that? After Sullivan's work is Frank Lloyd Wright. And so here I am showing you the Guggenheim. There's many, many buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright's that I could show you, but I'm kind of want to emphasize this issue of form follows function and individual expression that comes from it. So this was, as most of you know, is an art museum, and the intention for its manner of layout was that you wouldn't, in a normal museum, you would walk in, there would be one room, there would be a series of paintings, there'd be another room, another series of paintings, but it's the room after room that felt strange to Frank Lloyd Wright. He liked the idea that you just, in exploring art, was one path of one thing after another without with a continuous band or path, without being broken in from room to room to room. So he imagined this building so that you come in at the bottom floor, which we're seeing here, the entrance, you take the elevator to the top, and your museum experience is simply a slow descending of the spiral on the way down, and the walls are covered with art on the way. It was the first time a museum was ever thought of in such a way. And if you've ever had the chance to explore an exhibit in here, it is a really, really wonderful way to explore the art, because you're never taken off of the path. You never have this break from, oh, I'm entering another room, or any kind of odd sensation. You were allowed to really fully immerse yourself in the art, and the slope that comes down is gentle enough that you don't feel rushed. You just kind of slowly, almost imperceptibly, walk yourself down the spiral.
Sherri, can I make a quick comment?
Yeah.
I love this building, and unfortunately, most of the art they display, most of the times I'm not interested in.
True.
So it's been very difficult for me. So the first time I found something where I was thrilled to going there was an exhibit on the history of the development of the motorcycles.
Yes.
And they had all these motorcycles along the ramp.
Yes.
So you could just walk past them. So that's my fond memory of this building.
Yes.
And actually, since it's all one continuous ramp, you can actually drive the motorcycle.
Yes.
You know, that's how they got them in too.
Wonderful.
Well, I love that kind of an exhibit in here, especially because it just increases that emphasis on the spiral and the turning. I think that's the most perfect kind of exhibit. We've seen a couple of exhibits there over the years, but you're right. Sometimes it has to do with what's on exhibit at the time. So then after, this was built in the 50s. So I'm kind of jumping around a little bit on dates here, but I also wanted to let you know a little bit, as since we're in New York, visually here, virtually in New York, I wanted to bring out the Empire State Building. Here is another example, because, you know, we were talking about skyscrapers before, but those were skyscrapers of the 10 to 16 story range. And we've jumped to an entirely different scale of skyscraper by the time the 1930s come along, and we've got the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building. Now, I put this one in instead of the Chrysler Building because I know happens to be Shrikant's favorite. He once had an office. I don't think you still do you, in the building?
No, but I used to have the office on the 76th floor of of this Empire State Building, and that would be on the other side of this picture, facing the tip of the island.
Yes, yes. And one of the things that is important to note about form follows function in skyscrapers once it gets to this height is that you have an entirely different structure that happens. Because when you think of the number of elevators that are needed to get from 0 to 16, it's a bank of maybe 6 or 8 elevators, and they take up generally a core in the center of the building. But when you get to a height this high, you don't take that core all the way up, because you don't need the same number of people who come in the lobby. They don't all go up to the top, only a certain percentage. So what they do is they drop elevators off. In other words, some elevators go part way up, some go 2/3 of the way up, some of them go all the way up. And what that does is it allows more square footage per floor. And when you see that on the exterior of the building, there's more than one reason for this, but the elevators is one. You'll see that skyscrapers often, at the taller ones, will step back. They step back because of the floor square footage needed for elevators. And they also step back, in New York especially, for zoning code to allow more airflow and light to all of the surrounding buildings. But there's more that happens as this idea of form follows function is developed and we get to brand new materials. And one of those is what's called form resistant structures. And you can all take a piece of paper and do this same example. I apologize for the blurry, pixelated quality of the image, but if you take a piece of paper, and this is a fun program, a fun thing to do with kids, especially because they don't expect this to happen. If you take a piece of paper and just hold it by its end, and I've got a piece here, if you just hold it by its end, it just flops. You couldn't put a pencil on it, because if you hold it out and then put the pencil on, the pencil just falls. But if you do in the second photo and you curve that bottom of the paper so that you're making a curve like that, that is a form resistant structure. And then suddenly it'll hold a pencil. It might hold several pencils. And the last image there is a folded structure. And you might remember, if you ever remember going to airports, some airports, especially those built in the 1970s and early 1980s, often had what's called a corrugated roof structure. And it makes this, it looks like corrugated metal, but on a much bigger scale. These are all what are called form resistant structures. They get their structural rigidity and strength in a very, very thin amount of material by its shape. One of my favorite examples is, and this was part of my master's thesis that I was showing you guys earlier, if you take a racquetball or a tennis ball and you cut it in half and you try to take that racquetball shape and smash it down, it's extraordinarily hard to flatten it. You can't, because the shape of the dome, there's a curve in every direction, and every part of that curve is connected to every other part, which holds it rigidly in place. So that shell structure, the same as an egg, the same as a turtle shell, or a shell from a seashell, all of them are very, very thin amounts of material that get their strength from having curves. And so I wanted to show a few of these kinds of, what are we doing here, Rob? Okay, so here is a couple of different shapes. These are, you can obviously have a dome shape, which would be a single curve. Here are some examples of what's called double curved shapes. We've got the saddle shape, which Felix Candela was very famous for creating. And the saddle shape, if you notice in the drawing on the bottom, it's made by straight pieces of straight lines. And by creating where the straight lines connect, you can get this very, very fluid looks almost like water flowing or like a wave, but it's actually made out of straight pieces of formwork. But once you get that formwork, you can pour concrete over this. And once you get that formwork removed, you can get a very, very beautiful shapes. And so last week, Rupali shared with us the Baha'i Temple, and which is one of my favorite buildings, but I wanted you to see how it's made. So you can see here the structure and the formwork, which is all a bunch of pieces of lumber, all straight, all connected in different pieces to make a curved surface. And then concrete with amounts of iron wire, generally not thick rebar like you would have in a thick wall construction, but thin wall construction, they would use wires. And you can end up with these curved shapes that are quite thin. And so this is how they're made. They don't look like they're made out of straight pieces of lumber. They just look effortless and light. So the Baha'i Temple has one certain shape, very similar that you would see in the curves of the Sydney Opera House, but they also can take on a much more flowing shape, like this structure here, which, if you notice how thin those edges are, they look like they're made out of paper. It's probably about 2 inches, maybe less, of concrete reinforced with iron or wire on the inside. But you can just imagine the flowing shape that comes inside. And again, these are coming from the idea of form following the function. So these are structures where suddenly we need an open space on the inside. And I'm always brought back to this idea of the Roman Pantheon, which is 145 feet in diameter. And the dome has, the structure of the concrete dome is 23 feet thick at the base of the dome. At the very top of the dome, it narrows down to say 2 feet, but that's a lot of material and that's a lot of weight in order to span 145 feet. Well, now we are spanning 145 feet with a shell that's only a couple inches thick and full of windows on all of its side.
Am I correct? That's resting on like 6 points along the outside.
1, 2, 3, 6 or 8. I don't remember how many on this one. Then there's another form resistant structure called folded plates. And this was sort of like, the corrugated structure I mentioned earlier. But this looks like an origami experiment. And it probably originally started there. But you can take this kind of a structure and also span great distances with very little material in a very expressive form like this. And you can see the vast distance that this structure covers, and all in thin shell of concrete. And then one of my favorites, Pier Luigi Nervi, who was in the 1920s and 30s, was a pioneer in Italy. Felix Candela did it in Spain and in Mexico. And there are several others. And Rupali has lovingly shared us the same thing that was happening in Italy, or not in Italy, in India. This is another one of these structures that you need a big, wide, open space. This was done for an Olympics. And of course,
1960.
The 1960 Olympics, by then you're filming this for television. And what you really can't have is a whole bunch of posts holding up the roof structure where you can't see what's really going on. So what they've done here is there is this series around the outside. There are buttresses, which always look to me like a series of men leaning their arms forward and one leg back, holding up the structure. but and you can see in the drawing here on the left, you can see that sort of, it just always looks like people to me. But what happens is on the inside, you get this vast open space. And the amazing thing is all the way around this dome, you have glass. There isn't a column in sight. And you have this light structure all the way up to the oculus. And you can see up there, it's all the television cameras and lights for whatever happens on the stage. Sadly, this building's a little bit sad looking now. The outside is looking a little, it's still solid, but the top of it, the outside surface isn't nice and pristine and clean anymore. It's kind of grubby. But this currently still is in Rome. And here's another example with a photo taken way up high at the roof structure. So you can see this mathematical lattice work of a grid of the structural forces across the dome. And the white all along, the bright light is the sunlight streaming through, where it has to feel as if this is just floating on top. And then we have in the 1960s, we have a engineer originally from Bangladesh by the last name of Khan, who worked at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and started, I mean, I don't think he saw a skyscraper until he came west, but he had a very fresh way of looking at things and thought of, why don't we bundle tubes together? And so we know this, many of us know this as the Sears Tower in Chicago. But remember, Chicago has boggy soil, but you also have a fair bit of lake effect wind. So what he did is the lower structure in dark is a 9 square block of essentially structurally bundled tubes. And then as you go up higher and higher on the skyscraper, some of the tubes stop continuing higher up. They just terminate. And what that does is it gives this really wonderful three-dimensional sculptural effect of the skyscraper. It also coincides with where you no longer need elevators. So that has part of it too. But the really nice thing about the bundled tubes is that they're really rigid structures. So when the wind blows, the whole skyscraper doesn't move as much. That's one of the things that happens when you get taller and taller in a skyscraper. And so this is how it looks today. Today it's called the Willis Tower. But this gets brought, I wanted to make sure that we brought it all the way up to the current day to see that this idea of form following function still happens. When you get even higher, you start having more serious effects of the wind on the top of the skyscraper. It can cause the skyscraper to sway, but it can also cause wind effects if you have a skyscraper that is square or has 90-degree corners. It can cause wind effects on the back side of the skyscraper with the wind blowing around the back side. So one thing that happens is you end up with skyscrapers that are almost triangular shaped. And this is to decrease that amount of flow on the back side of the skyscraper. And this is the Burj Khalifa Tower in Dubai. And what I love is that this particular drawing shows you how, as you climb up in tiers, what shape of floor you end up with. And all of these, as you go up, change very much like the Sears Tower, but much more expressive, not quite so rigid and structural. And it looks much more natural because of it. And you end up with something that is quite amazing to see. So what I wanted for all of us to really notice is that, can you do the stop share, Ron? Oops. There we go. I can't deal with Rob's computer. I didn't go that way. Okay. So what I wanted us all to see, did I just bump us out?
I have absolutely no idea where we are. Oh, there.
There we are. Hang on, everybody. There we are. What I wanted us all to see is that since Louis Sullivan wrote this, his ideas of form follows function has really permeated the architecture industry. Now, everyone takes it a little bit differently, and quite often they take it to mean that architecture shouldn't have any detail or shouldn't have any ornament. And as we've all read, that's not what Sullivan intended when he wrote that. But know, as you've now finished reading, that these ideas have really taken a strong hold in the architecture community in one way or another. Everyone's taking it in their own way. Oh, we can't hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Loved seeing the Burj Khalifa too. I remember the last time I was there, they were cleaning the windows.
Oh.
So there were people right at the top cleaning the windows. Amazing stuff. And they've got this amazing fountain right at the bottom. And they have these great shows that take place. I think it's like 20-story fountains. So just great.
Lovely.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Rob, Joia, and Rupali. Maritza.
All right, so this man, this has been an amazing journey with a lot of you guys. It really has been. This book has been a transformative experience. It really has been. I've enjoyed it immensely, and so I'm still, even as I'm chatting, I'm not 100% certain which direction I want to go. So the first thought that came to mind in reading both of these chapters actually was a Spanish song by a Puerto Rican singer. And this song is amazing, both musically to me and verbally with the words. It's a crescendo, and it starts off with just two notes. And as she speaks of the words, it goes up and adding more music, more instruments, and it builds to this like huge crescendo mid-song, and then it goes back to two notes, and it builds up again to a crescendo, and then it comes down, and that's when it ends. And this song came to mind because it's called The Love, right? But really in Spanish that would be love. But she's describing the many phases of love and how it goes, and she does that not just with words, but she does it through the music. And that's what this made me think of, because I feel like these two chapters are Sullivan's explaining his crescendoing teachings, as it were. And I mean, if it would mean anything to anyone, I'll just mention very briefly and quickly the name of the singer is Yolandita Monge, and the song is called El Amor. It's a really long song, and I won't try to.
After your presentation, just go ahead and put a link in there.
Okay,
Thanks.
yeah, that would be probably best. But the very first lines she says is that love is a ray of indirect light. It's a drop of peace. It's a awakening faith. And that is what Sullivan is telling us as well here. Some of the things that I had highlighted here, Sherri did mention already, but I want to start with actually a line from the chapter on Spring Song. And it's probably a very small line in the scheme of what he's saying, but about 2/3 through this like poetic discourse, he says, how inarticulate and hoarse we are, the while all nature is in tune. And that, to me, is so vital a thing for us to remember. I think that it's a matter of, again, that one line puts into perspective. You know, he's speaking to a young architect who finished, you know, some fancy architecture school, and it's a matter of now he's saying, you know, move forth with proper perspective of your place in the universe. And that's what I hear in that line. Another thing that was really striking to me about this poetic discourse is this concept of, like, I have to say I was a little shocked by how prominent he uses the word love here, and how, you know, by the end of reading it, it seems so appropriate to me. And I was like, naturally, there's nothing else he could use. You know, he tells us love comes to life, life comes to love, the twain are one. And if we look at this from the perspective of what he's been telling us throughout the entire book, what he's saying to us is that if we love those things which we create, the creation process is improved. And I think he was also bemoaning the fact that not enough people in architecture and what he was seeing were doing that. Because if you're just spitting out a carbon copy of something that's antiquated and doesn't necessarily fit the purpose of what you're spitting out, then how could you possibly be creating that with love? It's just not possible. And if we were to think about it, you would be unable to make it in that manner. You would have to change the way you're making it. And another thing that came to mind to me is that, you know, in general, there are 5 elements, or what's taught is there are 5 basic elements of what comprises a poem. And reading this Optimism and Spring song really just points out to me that, you know, life is better if we view it as a poem, right? So imagery, rhythm, sound, density, and line. Those are what would be, you know, the 5 elements, you know, in general of a poem, even if it doesn't matter if you're using, you know, a very structured poem or a softer poem, they all use these elements in some way or form. And if we tie that to this concept of man as creator, which is what Sullivan is presenting to us. He actually says in Optimism, he says, and when we had reached our highest point, man, the priceless treasure, revealed himself to us, and we believed in him. Man, the creator, the redeemer. Okay, he also says the Messiah, but that might be going a little far. And if we pay attention to the rhythm of, I guess I'm going to use nature because it's what he's using here, right? But the rhythm of that which we propose to create, it is that mindfulness that allows us to strive for a balance that will, in the process, make both ourselves the creation and anyone whom that creation touches, the better for it. And I don't know, I think it's so many times throughout the reading of this tale here, I have had the thought, it's just that simple and it's just that hard. Because it really is a beautifully simple concept, but we're so flawed human beings that it's just difficult to remember and to maintain. But it's just lovely, you know. There's another section in the poetic discourse here that I just think it's so beautiful that I'm going to share it with you. And I don't even have anything written for it or any reason why. I just want to share it. For love is life. For love is you. For love is I. For love is the springtime. It is all in life, all in religion, all in philosophy. there's not much else to be said here, right? One thing, and actually, Sherri, I think this is something that everyone needs to say. So shall we will in the springtime. It is our time for willing. Now begin.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. I think it's been amazing having you join in this panel.
I've enjoyed it so much.
Because you bring to it, see, all of us, rest of us have kind of lived with this for 20 years. And it has the same kind of impact. I mean, the unusual thing is that the works of this kind, every time you come back to it, it has that kind of fresh wow that you get, and same kind of inspiration. So it's wonderful for you to see this for the first time and respond to it. Thank you. Next up is Rob.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. You think that by now I'd learn to mute when I start to speak, but I still find myself, in conference calls. Oh, wait. All right. So I think Maritza just mentioned, and Sherri also mentioned it earlier, and I think it's a really interesting thing that the end of the whole process, the very last word at the end is now begin. And I want to talk a little bit about the reason why it's now begin is at the end. And that is in this line where he talks about what he means by kindergarten chats. He says, we have arrived close to the ending of your primary education and the beginning of your new self-creative education. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about what he means by self-creative education. I know I'm going into Rupali's territory here because it really struck me that he's writing at a time when we know also that Maria Montessori is out there doing her work on education. And this idea of self-creative education as education being a self-driven process by the student, that the student isn't just passively absorbing information, isn't just repeating and imitating, but the student is being given the tools to go out and continue the process and begin to drive increasingly over the process of education, increasingly drive their own education and their own process of learning, and become increasingly independent as learners. And that's really what we see going on in a lot of this, especially in the first half of this book, where you have, the student begins saying more and more things, and being able to develop the ideas independently on his own, having been given the seed. We have to keep using this botanical and horticultural metaphors. This having been given the seed that's been planted at the beginning, he's able to then speak more in his own voice and develop these ideas himself. And that's the whole idea of a self-creative education. The idea of being able to, getting the skills to be able to develop your knowledge and your ideas on your own. And one thing that this struck me about it, I talked to Sherri about this. I didn't have time to go dig up all the references for this, but a while back, I happened to be reading, for purposes that aren't important here, happened to be reading the memoirs of Albert Speer. Now, Albert Speer is famous as
you would.
As one does. He's famous as the architect, in-house architect, the favorite architect of Adolf Hitler, right? He was the crony of Hitler, who sort of fell into his orbit. And as you can imagine, his memoirs are a lot of his memoir. His style of architecture was this sort of, I call it neoclassicism with elephantiasis, because he would take these neoclassical structures, but let's build them 10 times bigger. His idea is we have these new industrial building techniques. We can take a Roman temple, but we can build it, in this gargantuan scale. He built this giant dome for Berlin that was never built, but it was so big it had its own weather. It would have had its own weather inside. As you can imagine, a lot of his memoirs are talking about how basically him dealing with the question of how is it that I fell under the spell of this monster? How is it that I allowed myself to become an accomplice to someone who was so destructive? And he's he's able to put the blame on himself for. It's kind of interesting. It's the compelling thing about it is he actually is aware enough. He says at one point, when he talks about the point at which he met Hitler, he says, "At this point in my career, I would have sold my soul for a major commission, and here was my Mephistopheles." Right, so he got the chance to sell his soul. But he also talked about how his education had prepared him for this, because he talked about how the German education that he had when he was young, was very authoritarian style of education, right? It was not a self-creative education. It was an imitative, and I think Sullivan would call it a feudal style of education, where you are a passive vessel and you're there to repeat and to imitate the ideas put into you by the authority figures. And he said specifically, anything having to do with, this is sort of a semi-authoritarian political system in Germany in the late 19th century. So it says anything having to do with politics or with social questions or the organization of society, you are very much not encouraged to do any thinking for yourself or to, as a student, to be grappling with these issues and thinking them through independently. You're supposed to just leave those things alone. Those are for the authorities to set up and for them to decide on everything. And he talked about how it created this sort of authoritarian mindset that was already there in the public, waiting for the authoritarian dictator to come along and to take advantage of it. And so I think that's why it's so interesting that you also, at the same time, you had these innovators like Sullivan and like Maria Montessori, who were very much going in the opposite direction and saying, well, what we need is a self-creative education where you acquire the skills to look at things with your own eyes and to direct your own process of education and become independent, which is what the student is really doing here at the end. That's what the optimism is about in this chapter. The optimism is he will be able to go forth and develop these ideas on his own and show the results. That's the main thing I want to talk about. I just want to also mention, well, my eyebrows went up with this line that Maritza also quoted, where she says, he says, when we had reached our highest point, man, the priceless treasure, revealed himself to us and we believed in him. Man, the creator, the redeemer, the Messiah. Now, I think Maritza, I probably grew up Catholic in a Catholic country, so you blanched a little at man as the Messiah because it is blasphemous in a way. He's man is something you believe in, something that's the creator, something that's the redeemer, something that's the Messiah. It's really like an apotheosis of man. That it is appreciation for man's powers, as he puts it, that we begin to see man as almost as a godlike figure here, or literally in this case, as a godlike figure, as a creator, a redeemer, and a Messiah. And I think that takes that idea of self-creative education and self-creative power, takes it to its ultimate logical conclusion, that man becomes his own creator and his own Messiah, because he has that power of creation that he has unleashed by unleashing his mental powers. And that makes for quite a climax to the whole series.
Are you done?
Yes.
Let me just jump in and one last second on Rob's time here to say that I think that I may have figured out why it is that Shrikant always reads books from the end first, is because in Kindergarten Chats, the very last sentence is now begin. So I think we finally figured out where this comes from with Shrikant.
Yes. See, that's the thing. So yeah.
That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. And I think this issue of kind of self-education is huge because it's a different view of human being. Like the core prime mover as being within each individual, and your.
He uses something.
So it's like and kind of starting off with that, and so he's like his distinction between feudal way of thinking and democracy. That's exactly what it is. So an education.
I like the fact that you use prime mover because that's another.
It is used in this.
Is it used in here?
Not in that chapter,
okay,
but earlier.
It's another theological term. I mean, this is something taken from Aristotle and then imported into Christian theology with God as the prime mover. So it's another theological term being borrowed here.
Yeah, and I think the transcendentalism as philosophy is closer to the Indian view of God. Indian view of God is Tat Twamasi. That means you are it. So it's like it holds that there is God within each of us. So it's not, God is not outside. So this is exactly what Sullivan is talking about. It's within you. The kind of the core moving principle is within you, and you start from there. Next up is Joia.
This is perfect because everybody is picking up on all the themes that I wanted to talk about today too. As far as I'm concerned, this is a grand celebration and the timing even seems to be perfect. It's even Jodi's birthday too, so that makes it even more of a celebration. Happy birthday to Jyoti. I feel like Sullivan is here celebrating with us. We're at the climax, the end of this book. We have springtime. It actually is springtime. It's the last weekend of spring before next weekend, Memorial Day. People always think of as being the unofficial beginning of summer, but this is it. We're at the climax of the springtime. And here we have just this wonderful festive celebration. And it does, I think, bring together all of the threads that we've been exploring all this time. So everyone else who's come before me has pulled on so many of the things that I wanted to read and talk about. And I'm sure Rupali, again, is going to come up with this idea of self-creative education, which I had circled multiple times the first time I read this and multiple times again. I even just love the phrase self-creative education. We talk about self-education, but Louis Sullivan here really gives us this emphasis about the creation, that it's self-creative education. And one of the things I have in my notes here that to me has always been so profound about the way this book ends, that it ends with optimism and a spring song. I always think back to what we know of Louis Sullivan's life. And so Sherri started by showing us the wonderful legacy of his ideas throughout the 20th century. But when you look back to think about what his actual life was like, what it must have been for him to be writing the first draft of this in the early 1900s, to revisit it again in 1918, right after World War I and all of the destruction of that, there would be so legitimately room for pessimism, cynicism, depression, and yet it's such the opposite of that. And I think it really gets to the heart of what you could call, I believe, Louis Sullivan's philosophy, what he understands about what deeply matters in life, his whole system of what nature is all about, what life is all about. And this is a philosophy which culminates in this idea of the constantly reoccurring eternal springtime, when you really connect in with the cycle of nature in that way, and with the human being, with their power of creation, the power of willing, which is the other big theme that I wanted to make sure to talk about today. So one passage that I wanted to bring up, because I think it starts to summarize what we've seen here, is where he even gives us his view about why optimism is justified, which probably would have been a thought, especially if you imagine when this book was coming out in 1918, it might have been one of the most pessimistic times in human history in the West. And yet he's really making an argument for optimism. And I love what he says here, that that we have seen enough to know that a modern optimism must be based on a faith in things and assurances fairly well seen, rather than a vague essence of things unseen. And among these things and assurances fairly well seen by us are man's powers and the creative fertility of nature. So I think that's just a beautiful summing up, and even ties into what Maritza and Rob were getting into, that there are perhaps these religious overtones, but we're going beyond the mysticism of the religion, because we can ground this philosophy in something that is well seen, as he says here, not unseen. And what we can ground this in, as he points out to us, are man's powers and the creative fertility of natures. The idea of the fertility of nature in the springtime, that song of love, which is perhaps the ideal way in which generations reproduce, through some feeling of love, this grand view of love that has this fertility to it, and then simultaneously that same ability of human beings to have that creative, fertile power, man's powers, as he points out to us. And then also in this chapter, I wanted to bring up where he I think puts his stamp on what he hopes that we get from having gone through this journey together. So I wanted to read this paragraph as well. He says, "If you have taken to heart the substance and spirit of our various chats and experiences together, if you have thoroughly absorbed them, they will reappear in due time, newly expressed through your individual nature, tempered, colored, and I hope amplified by the influence of growing observation, experience, and reflection, until you are completely convinced not only that architecture is a plastic art, but that you have become a master of the sane and beautiful plastic art of expression, a master at once of democratic thought and democratic art, and that thus you are inspired. To me, I think this brings together all of the threads that we've been talking about here. When you start with man's powers and the creative fertility of nature, when you go out and have this growing wealth of experience. Shrikant said something, I guess it was technically at the end of the last meetup, about how education often gets wasted on the young. But here we have a completely different view of education, this idea of self-creative education that is going to keep happening, that is just amplified by growing observation, experience, and reflection. And that what you get when you do this is becoming what he considers the master of the democratic art. And we had talked in some of our previous discussions of the specific concept he has about freedom and what that means, and the way that he uses democracy in that way, and how he sees this as the climax of what you can be as an architect, and I believe as a human being. And then we come to our final chapter, which is this song, this spring song, as Maritza beautifully pointed out. It is a song about love. It is a song about life. And I want to point out too, it is a song about willing. I will. We had learned from Sullivan that he believes the function of the architect is to interpret and initiate. And here we get this idea of the architect as the one who initiates, who wills. And so you all know that I love the poetry. So I just wanted to read at least some of the poetry. Honestly, I could have read this whole chapter with all of the poetry, but I'm just gonna read to you just one little brief portion of it, which I think does just capture so much of the spirit of this whole chapter. So this is in the middle of the chapter. He says, "See how the dogwood blooms. Shall I sometime bloom like it? Surely you shall, if you will. The dogwood blooms in love spring and bloom. For love is life, for love is you, for love is I. For love is the springtime. It is all in life, all in religion, all in philosophy. And without love, alas, does not the wild azalea tell you this? Need I tell it? I? What am I? It is the spring, not I. But where is my spring song? When shall it begin? How raucous my treble grates within this splendor. How pallid my wish and will against this polychrome. How shallow I, how void of all but love. With overflowing heart I try to sing, and the springtime sings and sings in ecstasy. I have not lost the ear to hear. I listen and am amazed anew. Such beauty, such gentleness, such fluency, such gracious pride. Behold the far-flung glory of the spring. Hear her call, hear her echoing splendor everywhere. Oh, for an art of spring, a comprehending utterance. Oh, for one mighty soul to hear and sing the song of spring. One man to chant this hymn of hymns. How inarticulate and hoarse are we, and while all nature is in tune. Oh, let there be one vibrant voice to answer, to proclaim, to sunder the vast sky with pealing anthem. One heart to swallow up the saturating radiance here. Behold, here is the volcanic warmth of life, the mighty power of resurgent growth. The ardent soul of all is here. Oh, for one eye to see, one will to shape. And then, of course, we come to the very climax of the poem, which everyone has read, and I'm going to read too, and I think Rupali is going to read it, and Shrikant should read it, and we all should read it again, the very end of this beautiful poem, this beautiful book. So shall we will in the springtime. It is our time for willing. Now begin. So I just ask you, what will you begin in this springtime? Thank you.
Wow, excellent, wonderful, Joia. That's great. Let's see how to respond to it. Because the thing is that this is like, I love this kind of the way in which he ends. He's able to pull together all the themes from everywhere and just, you know, do the right climax. Yeah, I always think of Beethoven in this whenever I think about structures. And this is like you marshal everything over a long period of time. And then all of it kind of builds up. And then there is this big finale. So that's exactly what it is. Wonderful. Rupali.
So, you know, as Shrikant said, Louis Sullivan has been building up this journey, and here we are at the end. And what he's talking about is the powers of man. What powers do we have? The creative spirit. And the highest power is that of love. So you can see that in his poem, why he talks so deeply about love. And all of this, throughout the book, we've learned it is inspired by nature. So he has taken the student into the, he calls it out of doors. And so outdoors to experience firsthand what nature has to offer in different seasons. And from that, the student then discovers his own will. And Louis Sullivan talks about will. Joia just mentioned that. And then Louis Sullivan urges us that, you know, because we all have that will, we can create the world that we want to live in. So that's basically where he is leading us. And I'm going to share my screen here. So one of the things that I have done during my journey in this meetup is focused on education and how education and Louis Sullivan's ideas with Montessori are in harmony. Rob, you did a fantastic job of explaining how they go together about self-creative education. So let me just share my screen. One of the things that we do at our school is, and many Montessori schools do this, Maria Montessori believed that children learn best when they are in nature and when they are immersed in learning from nature. So we take our students on a trip outside every year in spring. So in this chapter, in this poem, in the spring song, Louis Sullivan starts with the idea of love. And he says, where love is not, naught else exists. Love is love. It is the power of all powers. It's why we live. So he talks about love, not in a romantic way or a sexual way, but he talks about love as compassion. And he says love is the power of powers. So we've gone through these chapters and looked at all of the different powers of man, the power to think, to be creative, to make moral choices, to have the capacity to make proper choices for living in a world that's going to exalt humans and man. He talks about recognizing the individual, the power of looking at what we are each capable of, and then also a relationship to others, to ourselves, to other selves, to our world, to the universe, And he says that unless we have this passion and unless we develop an understanding for the world, we cannot have the passion to create our own art and to create our own form of art, whether it's literature, music, architecture, anything that you might consider as art. And in this poem, the student and the teacher are going back and forth, and they are creating the song, the spring song together. And here, Maria Montessori, she talks about taking students out in nature and letting students discover for themselves that what life is or what the world is. So here we spend almost a week out in nature every year, and it's just at springtime. So there's a lot of, the snow is melting, there's moss right around the edges, there are ferns that are just unfurling, you have new leaves, you have animals that children can see and find. And it's just a fantastic immersive experience in nature. Now I'm going to show,
take a moment to observe them.
Pause this for a minute. But in the poem, the student talks about spring in literal terms and the teacher talks in metaphorical terms. So the student says, how languorous the gentle breeze, how suasive are the opening birds, how softly sings the spring of infancy. It is the spring. It is the spring of springs. The newborn, the delicate, the ineffable. 'Tis what which melts dissolve. 'Tis what which wakens love. It is the joy which causes love to bloom forever in the garden. It is spring. It is the dawn. And so I want to share with you, how students learn about newborn life and experiences that teach much more than what is taught through textbooks. Rob pointed out, the feudal way of teaching, where it's, and we see this when we go out on nature classroom trips, that children can think for themselves, they can draw their own conclusions from these experiences, and they don't have to be told what this means. So here is an experience.
You can wave goodbye to your favorite praying mantis. No, they're all just moving pretty slowly because it is getting colder. All right, my friends. So
I think my favorite one
is the one that's hanging down.
Yeah, that's my favorite one.
right. Well, we are going to release a bunch of them, so I'm going to take the top off. Okay, friends. And we're not going to be able to release all of them tonight because I have another place. Yeah. So they'll find their own way out, but I am going to encourage them a little.
Can I feel one?
I'm not going to let them crawl on you because we don't have too much time. But here's one adventurous friend. I hope they have an excellent life here in our field, eating all those bugs.
Are any
All right, now I want to keep the two sticks, so I am going to just take the sticks out for a second.
Put it on the leaf and floor.
Come on out. Oh my god. Now we can just, there's a clump. There is a clump of them, and eventually they will extricate themselves. I'm also going to give this a shake so that some of them come off. Shoo. Shoo. Sprinkled in the field, separated enough where they will be able to make their own ways. Even though they were just born today, these little babies have most of the skills they need to survive as adults. The only thing they really need to do now is grow bigger. So they're going to work hard on that, finding the tiniest bugs this area has to offer. This little adventurous friend, I think, is going to go on this stalk here. I won't flick this one. Amazing. And this friend seems to be clinging real close to home, so we're going to put them back inside. We still have a good amount of them to release when they are a little bit bigger.
So here's one experience of looking at very, newborn, delicate, ineffable creatures in nature. We hatch chicks every 3 years. We do butterflies, we do silkworms. So children get to see the life cycle of different animals. So then the student, having discovered for himself, he says, it is the hour, love comes to life, life comes to love. The twain are one. And he's talking about how love and life are the same. They're both the same, that, if you have this capacity to appreciate values, to create your own goals, to focus on what you want to create, basically, then you are passionate about what you want to do. So then here I'm going to show three different slides, three different short films. Now in Optimism, I think Rob already read that, so I'm not going to read the whole passage about man, the creator, the redeemer, the Messiah, but I'll just read on further. I have marked out for you a tenuous but a secure foundation of thought, in the making of which you have bravely assisted in your enthusiasm of optimism, a basis of sanity and goodwill. And among these things and assurances fairly well seen by us are man's powers, the creative fertility of nature. So in this, he's talking about how you can learn from nature and make observations, investigate. He's led us through this entire book about just looking at things first on a sensorial basis, then looking at things in a more investigative manner, and then coming to conclusions and creating your own act out of it. So whether your own artwork, and this was just out in nature that I'm just going to share.
This looks like a hammer. Did you notice that this looks? I wonder how it's shaped like that. It almost looks like a pickaxe or a hammer that you could use. Oh, very interesting.
So he's just found this piece of wood that looks very interesting.
Grains look like they're going this way, so that probably meant this was the trunk, this was a branch, and then it got pulled off in this shape.
And so now he's drawing conclusions from his
Need a
observations.
baby next? Yeah, as long as you're far enough away.
And then he just used his imagination to create something out of nature. And then, the fact that nature offers this source of optimism and creation is just amazing. So in this, the teacher in the poem in Spring Song says, "It is the spring, the languorous surging spring, the sensuous mighty spring, the erotic spring without within, the spring of action, of ebullient blare, charged with love, charged with fecund passion, charged with the infinite affection, charged with desire, charged with the power to do." And so Louis Sullivan is leading us into talking about the power that we can create.
Need a baby next?
Okay. In this journey through all of the seasons that we saw with the student went out for a summer outing, the student went out for a fall outing, there was the storm, there was this abundance in nature, and then the student faced winter. And while we were out in nature, just going about on a trail, these students came across the skeleton of an animal that was lying right out there. And of course, they had to investigate. So they dug out the leaves and they found the ribs. And they were trying to figure out what kind of animal had lived there and how it had died. And then, when children experience this out by themselves, then they understand the cycle of life. They understand the meaning of death. And they become resilient too. They're not afraid. They're more curious. On the right is a tree that probably had died many, many, many years ago. But in there, it's still continuing to provide a source of nourishment or even habitat for many animals in there. So there are these big holes, and we could see that there were little creatures crawling on that. So in his poem, Louis Sullivan talks about radiant spring, inspiring spring, The glory and the gentleness of her power will come to you. Use it wisely, use it well. You shall prevail. Enamored and enamoring spring, the spring that follows winter of the heart, for the heart has ever season, such as man. And so he is preparing his student, for life, and to know that there is this roller coaster of life, that you are on a journey, but if you have a focus on your creative powers, on your values, you're going to make it through this. And the student says, but where is my spring song? When shall it begin? He says, shall I sometime bloom like this? And the student is still, asking these questions. And the teacher gives him the assurance that, yes, you will, if you surely you shall, if you will. And here he talks about the will, the capacity to make something based on the human judgment, the architect's values, the architect's choices, the use of forms, the use of materials that the architect is going to do. Now, in this picture, we have an art museum right next to our school, and every winter they have an exhibit called Flowers in Winter. And so the florists come and they design an exhibit which is inspired by the artwork. So this is in the Roman and Greek gallery, and you have the statue at the back. This flower arrangement is inspired by that statue, and you can see the crown, that's the head that is missing, but then you have the flow of the fabric, and you can see that flow through the flower arrangements and the white flowers. And so every year the teachers will take our students to this exhibit, and we talk about not only the artwork, but then the abstraction of the symbolism or the meaning that you can draw from that artwork. So again, whatever artwork people choose to follow, if you have the will, then you can create. And so here are some examples of, Sherri did a fantastic job of showing how people have been inspired by form follows function. And I cannot skip ferrocement in this, and my teacher, Vishnu Joshi. So there's the form inspired by nature. It's a cobra, very prevalent in India. And the story of how the cobra holds the world on its head, on its hood. So there's the framework for that, water tank. And then we have Oscar Niemeier's structure in Brazil. And then we have, of course, everyone knows about falling water. But, there are so many ways to express creative ideas. And so I'm going to go back to the chapter called Oasis. And early on in the book, Louis Sullivan says to the student, I mean, here is a man for you to look at, a man that walks on 2 legs instead of 4, has active muscles, heart, lungs, and other viscera, a man that lives and breathes, that has red blood, a real man, a manly man, a virile force, broad and vigorous, and with a whelm of energy, an entire meal. I mean that stone and mortar here spring into life and are no more material and sordid things, but as it were, become a very diapason of a mind rich stored with harmony. And in this poem, towards the end, he says, the spring is singing her gladsome song. Hear it, all my lad. Hear its diapason. Hear the splendor of its flow. Remember it forever. Then surely will another spring arise. You shall prevail. Then surely will be a springtime come into the garden of the heart. You shall prevail. Then will come beauty, and then will come power. Then create. you shall prevail. Be not self-shamed, as spring is not self-shamed. Be virile to the end. And so he's, throughout, at the beginning of the book, he says the same thing, but the student doesn't grasp that. But by the end of the student's journey, the student has come to realize that within him lies the power and that he can begin. And everyone has said this, and I'm going to repeat the last few sentences of this poem. So hope in the spring, it is time for hope. So shall I believe in spring, it is the time to believe. So shall we will in the springtime, it is our time for willing. Now begin. And with that, I feel that all of us have within us what we can do, and what is it that you are going to create? What is it that we are going to create for the world that we live in?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. I'm going to talk about two things. One, I'm going to talk about spring. I'm very much of a city dweller. I'm very much of a New Yorker. I noticed that there is spring when tourists pout at the base of the Empire State Building. That is the definition of spring. And we're seeing something similar. COVID has been winter for all of us in many, many different ways, along many, many different dimensions. And with the amazing vaccines, which are truly amazing. I mean, I always think about it, because it's like, if you look at the history of vaccines in this shorter time, with this level of effectiveness, with this new technology, which is not really vaccine, it's not really dead previous ones, but it's like something pretending to be that. So it's truly miraculous. Another spring is starting, and I can see it in the city. I can see it today, under my window here. And what will we do with it? And I think that winter clears out many dead things that we were doing by habit, which were not really critical for us. We just did things a certain way. Thanks to this winter of COVID, many of the dead things can be thrown away. And that clears the ground for living things. Last weekend, I went and met with my niece, my sister, Rupali and Rohit. It was amazing. It was amazing. And it's kind of, and not realized how much I had missed them. It's been years, it seems like years. It was almost a year and a half. And we're not gone without seeing each other for that long. So in many, many different ways, I'm now meeting with my friends who are all vaccinated. All of us are vaccinated, and spending time with them. And it's a question, it's all spring. It's a new beginning. So this is it. So it's more than just the seasons. This is much larger spring that we're talking about, that we are living through. And I think this chapter is a perfect one to kind of begin it with. I also want to take an opportunity of kind of stepping back and looking at Sullivan, because we have a little bit of time. So I want to introduce one concept that Sullivan uses again and again at various places. But I've just begun to see the value of it, because I was able to connect it up with other works. Tomorrow, we are going to do a meetup on language as interpretation. Okay. Louis Sullivan talks about man as interpreter. I think that's a very profound concept, and it's a very unusual concept. Interpreter. Okay. Because it brings together so many things. It means that you care about nature, you are emotionally in tune with them, tune with the nature. You're speaking it out, you're interpreting it. So there is this loop of taking in impressions and speaking out that is there throughout. You are continuously trying to interpret. You're trying to improve your interpretation. You're capturing more and more. You're trying to become more and more precise, more and more broader. You are continuously looking for the meaning behind things. You're not just saying things. You're saying, what is the heart of it? You're also, there is a feeling of saying, am I getting this? Am I getting this curiosity of actually trying to listen to this amazing thing and to kind of speak back, to interpret it? So I think interpretation actually explains. Many people, when they first encountered Louis Sullivan, notice the fluidity of his language. I think that comes from this approach, which is this approach of language as interpretation is very different from what is commonly accepted. Commonly accepted notion of language is that you're trying to capture a picture of reality. And you're saying, okay, have I grasped it? So it's like a visual concept of almost taking an image and saying, in this logos, I have captured it. You can see this very dramatically in Plato, for example. Plato railed against artists and he banned them from his Republic. Why? Because artists engage in mythos, whereas Plato thought that you should engage only in logos. Mythos is the story. It captures all the values in an integrated way, which is concretized in a person, which you're trying to emulate. That's how Homer shaped the Greek culture. Reading of Homer shaped, or not reading, speaking of Homer shaped Greek culture. Plato saw logos as being opposite of that. Not Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan sees the integration between logos and mythos. And that's where the kind of interpretation comes in. The logos is very powerful. It's a way of, this is Walter Ong's ideas, which we are going to talk about tomorrow at 2:30. Logos is very powerful. It digitizes things. It identifies things in discrete, focused way, in a structured way. But for it to be effective, it has to be continuously being fed by mythos through this interpretation, through relentless dialogue. One of the researchers who is studying Julian Jaynes talked about his experience at a lab. He was working with a fairly high level scientist, large number of people. And his observation was very interesting. He says, I've never had so much social interaction. And what was the social interaction? It was the scientists talking about the ideas, because that's how they formed and built their ideas, through this intense flow of communication. And that's what Louis Sullivan does with language, with thought. And that's what gives his works, his writing, this poetic quality, this the flow. And that's exactly what it gives the same quality to his building. So I wanted to make this point about man as interpreter, or language as interpretation, which captures actually all the faculties of human beings. It captures the deepest metaphysical visions. It captures epistemology. It is charged with ethics fully. It is very much aesthetic. So it brings in all the branches of philosophy in everything that you're saying and doing. So, man as interpreter, I think, captures fundamentally what is the right way to approach life. All right, so I want to open it up for comments, questions. You're just anything on Louis Sullivan, anything on Kindergarten Chats is fair game. So we'll start with Joia, Ash, and Dimitri. Joia.
I have a question for you because I love what you're saying here about interpretation and how this is so important and central. And when I read Sullivan, to me, it's always been remarkable how when he talks about the function of the architect, which I think is the function of all human beings, he says, interpret and initiate. The function is to interpret and initiate. And I've always even seen these not as two separate things, not as two separate functions, but as one idea, one loop. I would see it that way, to interpret and to initiate. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts, if you see it the same way, or if you have thoughts about how interpretation links with, to interpret and initiate, how it links with initiation, especially because we're ending with the end, which is to begin, to initiate.
Right. I mean, the concept interpretation that I'm using is one concept. Your interpreting nature means you're saying you are speaking out in your work. This is what nature is. So like a building is an interpretation of a need that exists. So it includes both listening and speaking. It most emphatically includes initiation. It is receiving and initiating. So it's that entire loop. So it is just one concept that captures both. Does that? Okay. Next up is Ash, Dimitri, and Joe. Ash.
Yeah, so I was really moved by Joia's presentation about this idea of how Sullivan maintained this fundamental sense of optimism in spite of both, his own career trajectory in his personal life and also, the state of the culture at the time after World War I. And to me, what really stands out about that is how, it may seem like when you're looking at things from a narrow perspective like that, out of, based on negative emotions like fear, that pessimism might seem to be justified. But when you take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective, like she also mentioned, Sullivan's ideas did end up triumphing in many ways, as Sherri talked about throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. And, and civilization has continued to progress in spite of things like the world wars and things like that. So really, pessimism is just fundamentally irrational, wildly irrational. And I also wanted to talk about, Rupali mentioned, he talks about love, and that's kind of the driving force in this spring song. And Rupali mentioned, well, what does he actually mean by love? And it's broader than this idea of romantic love. She tied it to his conception of compassion, but I think it also encompasses both his conception of the will and that which you live for, and your creative capacity, your faculty, your potential, but also this sense of optimism, this fundamental belief that creative potential will win out in the long run over the destructive or chaotic forces in life and in the universe. And to me, before this book, we started our art discussions in this time slot by reading Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto. And to me, this conception of love of Sullivan's reminds me of Ayn Rand's idea that she called the benevolent universe premise. And so it's this idea that, because a lot of people view the universe as kind of like hostile to life. And really, especially here on Earth, you look around you and it's just teeming with life. It's everywhere. and so really, I think the way to look at it is from this kind of optimistic perspective that the universe is really not just hospitable, but really encourages and fosters growth and creation. And so, yeah, that's really what I'm taking away from this. And so thank you all for this really wonderful series. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ash. Next up is Dimitri. Dimitri, I know that you're new to Louis Sullivan, but go ahead, ask your question. Dimitri, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, next up is Joe. Is there a problem? Give me a second. Joe, are you having a problem unmuting? Give me a second. Let me see if there is a problem. Oh, just a second. Sorry about that. My fault. Dimitri first. Dimitri first.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, this is really quick. Yeah, I was having issues with unmuting. So as I was listening to the conversation about education, right? Someone who's kind of learns, and great title, Kindergarten Chat, and then you then have a foundation, then you can grow up, kind of like how a tree grows in nature and starts as a small, and then as it grows up. And then as I was thinking about all the conversations, Sherri's conversations about architecture, and I thought back, okay, the first skyscraper in Chicago, 1880s. After the earthquake, after, there's a need to, build up in order to house folks. Well, also in the 1880s, you had robber barons.
Dimitri, can you keep it short so that we can get
No, I'm gonna end in like 2 sentences. Okay. The robber barons are another force, prophet is king at that time, right? So you had, we need to build high up in order to house everyone. You had prophet is king, and then you have art, right? Build nice, good-looking architecture. So how does Louis Sullivan, his ideas and his contemporaries, beat out the prophet is king? That's what I'm trying to kind of figure out. Out of all those forces, how does Louis Sullivan have the momentum to go forward with his ideas?
I think actually that still exists. You still see the competition between those two ideas in everyday building all around the world. I really think it's still very much there.
Okay, I just want to add one thing. Actually, that question is a fantastic question of saying, okay, how do all these different aspects of the phenomena of lots of people wanting to be in the same place, and the only way for them to be in the same place is to go up, and the technology now that has made it possible at that point, plus the art, how is that connected with art, and how is that connected with money? Okay, that's exactly what one of his essays, tall building, artistically concerned, considered, is about. And we are going to be going through those essays. I don't know, is that going to be in the first batch or the second batch, Sherri?
Second batch.
Second batch. So 2 weeks from now, we will be dealing with how he answers the question. It's essay number 3. Okay. Okay. So that, tall building, artistically considered. So if you read that in Kindergarten Chats, that would be a good place to start. Okay, let me see.
3 weeks from now, because I don't know if you told everyone, but we're taking next week off.
Oh yes,
and then,
yes.
So it won't be next week, and then the following week we'll do the first set of essays, and then the week after that we'll have the tall building.
Wonderful. So there is no meetup next week. Let me see here. Okay, let's start with let's go with Joe. Joe, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, fantastic presentations all around again, and thank you again for leading all these discussions. But something interesting that I've been thinking about is the idea of the self-creative education, and it's so ideal. I mean, I think that everybody would agree that it is ideal, but I was wondering, is it scalable? Is this something that scales so that where it could service an entire society? I actually have a second question I would like to throw in there really quickly too. If we live, let's just say, in a hyper-logos culture, let's just take that for as a hypothesis. Why is that versus why have we gotten away from a mythos culture is the second question. So those are my 2 questions.
Maritza.
I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to answer you by going back to one of my favorite phrases in the entire book, as they reason. It's because the teachers, our teachers, have kind of closed us in. The way Sullivan says it is that your own mind has been carefully and hermetically closed by your so-called teachers. after they had put into it whatever product of the past they thought it should contain. And then my favorite saying, and thus, like any other sample of canned goods, you remain quietly on the shelf where you were put. And I know I'm cheating, but I just had to bring that up on the last session because I really think that the most important thing we should all get out of all these series, ask yourself periodically if you are like a canned good sitting on a shelf, so that you can remember occasionally that you should dust yourself off and shake yourself up so that you don't expire. Hopefully that answered, but no, I really think that we get stuck and we don't realize that we're stuck. And also sometimes, Joe, there's a, one of the initial 12 rules for life, Peterson tells us that, you know, we should stop and ask ourselves if those things which we are saying are truly ours, or if we're just regurgitating those words that we've heard from others. And that's kind of, I think also, we get in this rut of not realizing that we're just putting out hot air and we're not making any forward progress. And so I think that sometimes asking yourself, and we need more people to ask themselves if they're like collecting dust on the shelf, because if more people did it, less of us would be stuck up on that shelf.
Ali?
So I want to add here what Maria Montessori observed. The thing is that, you know, when you watch these children learn by using tools in the classroom or in nature, and you see how they come to their own conclusions, you really don't need a teacher to tell them that A plus B equals C, whatever the lesson is. The children arrive at those conclusions themselves, and in that process discover many more things that the adult has probably not even thought of. And she says in her book, The Formation of Man, there are obstacles in scaling this kind of education because the mentality of the people could not accept the other possibility that the nature of childhood can offer a solution for a problem which we adults cannot solve, that from the child came the fusion of what our mind conceives as an only contrast. So, you know, it was the, like Maritza said, our teachers, our institutions, our mentality of this is how children should learn. Even within the school, I noticed that, you know, parents who have not seen the benefit of self-creative learning, they feel that the adult is in charge and the adult needs to tell or teach. There are also, you know, political reasons why there are certain things that are taught. She said, you know, people who came to observe her school would ask her, how can you be so optimistic of human nature? As if any description of these phenomena were some sort of imaginative tale, or sometimes I had dreamt these things. And so even 150 years ago, and now the reason is still the same why we are not scaling these kinds of, you know, this method of education. There are, of course, currently many more Montessori schools or many more schools that are based on project-based learning, that are based on child-driven education. And when I say child-driven or child-centric, I mean that looking at the nature of the child and not just doing whatever the child wants to do. That doesn't lead to a good solution either. So there are many more schools now as compared to the past. And hopefully, as Louis Sullivan says, there will be a day when there'll be more democracy in education than feudalism.
Sherri.
A couple of data points on the increase in the scalability of this kind of education. And I always like to give really specific data points because they're really quite inspiring. So well before the pandemic, I think probably 2 years, maybe 2.5 years ago, I was at a Virginia Association of Independent Schools. This is not an association for Montessori schools. It's an association for independent schools. So most of those schools teach in a traditional way. They're just not public schools. They're independently funded schools. We as a Montessori, our kids' school is a Montessori school is part of that. And we went to a conference and they were talking about the need for innovation to keep current in pedagogy, educational methods. And we were sitting at our own school's table, a group of Montessorians, and they started going through this list of all the things that really need to be looked at, how to accomplish in your school to keep you current and to keep you up to date on the best understanding of how students learn. And as the little Montessori group sat there, and we went through tick, tick, tick down the boxes, they're all things that already happen in a Montessori school. So you didn't have to change anything. And so what's happening is you're seeing a lot of this happen around the country and around the globe, where schools are realizing that these ideas that started more than 100 years ago, the research on neuroscience is coming out and reinforcing those original observations, that this is a really excellent way to teach. And we're seeing, even in the US, there is a group called Higher Ground that has just recently gathered up, I don't know, some vast quantity of millions of dollars to modernize and scale up Montessori education. So it's definitely happening.
Wonderful. So I want to make one comment. I want to follow up on what Ash was saying, that Louis Sullivan was writing this in the middle of the First World War. Now, First World War was terrible. If you think Second World War was bad, First World War was one magnitude higher than that in terms of just its sheer pointless destruction. He's writing in the middle of that. Also, his career is completely destroyed, okay? And he's writing all of the stuff that he's written that we have. We've got Kindergarten Chats, Autobiography of an Idea, System of Architecture, all of it is written at that time. So that's what, and so first point I want to make is that the world that we live in is so much better. Okay, so like any kind of excuse of saying, oh, you know what, I really want, no. I mean, just the opportunities that are there right now are just sky high, okay? Secondly, all of this has to come from within. Like, you cannot get other people to do things. Give me just a second, there is some problem. Let me see what's going on here. Okay, that's fine. Give me a second. Okay. The way I see it is that all good people just do good work, just like Sullivan did, as much as possible, talk about it as much as possible, make the work as solid, as good as possible. There are limits of what you can't control. Whether somebody else is going to actually choose to think for themselves and say, okay, what is the right way to do this? And is going to adopt what you're offering them, that's up to them. And the scale of exactly when that happens, how that happens, there is a lot of variation in that, which you cannot really control fully. But what we can control is to produce stuff. So for example, look at this entire series of what we are doing here, okay? Firstly, it's a tribute to its success of Louis Sullivan. This is like 100 years plus after what he did, and we are here talking about it at a level which I think he would be proud of. He would think that we are not bad students. Let's put it that way, okay? At least that much, okay? And that's good. Second thing is that we are the thing that I talked about, interpretation, right? That's exactly what we are doing. You have these amazing voices, Sherri, Maritza, Rob, Joia, Rupali, okay? They are giving their own take on each of these things. So the density of material, the exploring of all kinds of nuances, implications that we are doing is at a level much higher, okay, than what was actually being done, has been done on Louis Sullivan. I'm confident that the series that we have is actually one of the best things out there, on probably the best thing out there on Louis Sullivan. When you put together the sheer quantity and the quality and the variety of material. Now the question of, I am sure that this is going to take off at some point. Some point, lots of people are going to find it. But when that happens is not something that is within our control. But the fact that we are producing it, I think that is within our control. And that's a fantastic thing. So it's, and there was one very interesting quote that Ayn Rand had, which I always like two, I'm not able to remember it word for word, but it effectively says that pursuing your highest goals now is like living in that world right now. So when you're actually, like, you're saying, okay, you are aiming at that thing that you're hoping to reach, but when you act with the fullest of your capacity towards that, you're actually living in that world. I don't know, maybe Rob or somebody knows the exact quote. Rob, go ahead. You need to unmute them.
There you go.
It's he who fights for the future lives in it today.
Yes.
It's the Romantic Manifesto, I'm pretty sure.
Yes. Wonderful.
I always took it to mean that in deciding in making a decision on what the future should look like and trying to build that future in your own life, you are actually making it real in your own life for yourself first. You know, there's all other saying that futurist types throw around, which is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. You know, oftentimes there's a new technology that's coming. There's somebody who has it. You know, there's like a half a dozen people who actually have it now. They're already living in this future. And it's just a matter of that then expanding out to the early adopters and then becoming more affordable. And then suddenly we all have it in our pocket. And I think there's something similar there with ideas and lifestyle and you know, when you have a vision of the future and you start working toward it in your own work, that you then start living that new way of living currently in your own life, and it just hasn't gotten distributed out to everybody else yet.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Joe's question is self-education scalable? It's the following question would be, is knowledge scalable? How do we scale it? That's, of course, we have like currently from our standard education form, do the way we see. But I would say this morning we have like a dough. It's a child don't need those formula. The child need is a door for all wonder from mystery. So,
Kevin, can you summarize your question again?
Yeah, my question is the knowledge scalable? So this is I would say the preset is wrong. It's like that's currently what we practice. Like if you think deep, like for example, when you mentioned that use modern technology writing, I got a shock. I thought it built in. Actually, you are right. That's the tools we learned after we born. Okay. Thank you.
Anybody wants to address it? Is knowledge scalable? Any thoughts? Now, I would certainly think it is. I mean, I don't know exactly where to approach the question, but I would say, definitely it is scalable. I mean, but in a sense, I would say a couple of things. See, knowledge is very interesting, and Sullivan actually makes this point again and again. Knowledge is not like this dead thing that you can take in. It's because most of people think of knowledge as form. And you're saying, okay, I don't have the forms. Let me just capture all the forms. Can't be done. Can't be done. You kind of have to learn it in a way where it is kind of functionated form, in the sense that you should know how, what is the motivation behind it. And that takes kind of individual initiative. You kind of have to relearn it yourself. Robert, Sherri.
Yeah, I was going to say we live in an era of scaled knowledge. You know, that you can go on Wikipedia, you can go on Google in 5 seconds. I mean, actually, this is something from in my writing work often comes to the forefront where, I used to say something like, I believe it was such and such a person who said, and I would attribute a quote to somebody, but I put that I believe because I didn't know for sure. I was half remembered and it's difficult to look up. Well, I can't do that anymore because 5 seconds I can go on Google and find out, did that person really say it? What was the original wording? What actually said it? All that sort of thing. Or I just finished editing an article where I had made sort of a back of the envelope calculation, and the editor came back to me and said, "Oh, well, actually, you go get the IMF figures on this, on how much how much the economy contracted because of the pandemic. The IMF has calculations on this. You can go look that up." And I look it up. It's so easy to find. Knowledge has definitely been, starting with the printing press, then with the internet, knowledge has been scaled up. But it's not just, like you said, knowledge isn't just something that's passively implanted in you. It's something you have to do the effort. Knowledge in the deeper sense, not, what's the statistic that the IMF published? That's a more concrete sense, but in the larger sense of really understanding something thoroughly, like going through a book like this and understanding what Sullivan had to say. It is an active process. It requires time. And that's the other way. And I think we live in a society in which knowledge is scaled because the average person has so much more free time now than they've ever had through all of human history. So much more free time and a basis of education to be able to spend time. We got, a bunch of ordinary people here taking time off on their weekends to go read through this book and understand it.
Are you calling me ordinary?
No, not you, everybody else.
Wonderful.
But
Sorry, everybody.
But seriously, but the idea is that that it's not just a handful of people in an ivory tower somewhere, or you go back 1,000 years. The only people doing this were monks. There was like a handful of monasteries throughout Europe where the skills of writing and access to books and the time to sit and think and pour over these books and read them and analyze them. There was this very, very small elite of people and a very few little institutions who could actually do this. And now it is distributed. It has scaled up. We can observe, that's an observable fact that all of this has scaled up tremendously in this geometric way. So I think that, yes, it's scalable, and we know it's scalable because we've seen it happen.
And I want to add here, I know Kevin is talking about knowledge, which is an act we all have to do independently in our own heads. But I always like to, especially with kids who are first learning art projects and things like that, I like to take them on the tour through how a book used to be made. And get them. Now, I don't actually tan and make the vellum, but I show them because, of course, the smell's a little.
You've made paper.
We've actually made paper, which is multi-day process to make a single sheet. So if you go back and you look at the process of making vellum and hand writing a manuscript or making paper one sheet at a time with a big screen, and you're making pulp, and if you see that process all the way through and you see every single step that goes through that, and it's quite shocking to then just print off or download kindergarten chats from an ebook and just instantaneously read it. You get a real visceral sense of how much the knowledge can be scalable simply by the ease of transmitting that knowledge from one to another.
Thank you. Tom, you had a question. Tom, go ahead.
Shrikal, can I just add to that before
Go
that
ahead.
question? Okay, so I think Rob and Sherri, you both talked about this, that, knowledge is something you can gather very easily. And in his chapter on the art of expression, Louis Sullivan talks about the abundance of knowledge. And he says, what more do you need? He says, nature furnishes the materials and you have but to use them with intelligence and feeling. So yes, we have all the knowledge, but what are we going to do with it is the goal of this book. That all geometric forms are at your disposal. They are universal for you to utilize them, to manipulate them, to transmute them with feeling and intelligence. Engineering science has substantially solved all problems of construction. The industrial arts, the so-called fine arts, mechanical arts, craftsmanship are at your disposal. Nature's manifold expressions of function and form are at your disposal. What more do you need as a medium of expression? The rest is up to you. So I think he's already said that, all of these, we have knowledge at our fingertips now, and how we use it to create the life that we want is up to us.
Wonderful. I want to follow up with a thought from Walter Ong. He's a very deep thinker on this. What he's saying is that there are two factors going on with language. One he calls digitization, and second he calls interpretation, of kind of holistic thing. So what happens is that every time people think of this as opposite things, digitization is kind of writing it down or printing it, or electronic distribution on a massive scale. So that digitization, availability of discrete parts is going up. But his really deep point is that in order to actually leverage that, you need to bring up your capacity of integration. It's like differentiation and integration. As the differentiation increases, integration that you need to do in order to actually leverage it, that bar keeps going up too. So it's like so for example, with all the information available, there is all the information available, but then being able to put all of that together in a short period of time, the skills that are needed to actually do that effectively is much more than what would be there if you were operating in a large university library, let's say 40 years ago. And that is much more than if you are operating with just few manuscripts you had sitting in your church. So it's like the amount of digitization has increased, but the amount of integration that you need to do in order to effectively use it for your life also keeps increasing. And both those have to move forward parallel. That's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, about how this has happened from like oral culture to written culture to print culture to electronic TV culture to digital culture, and how does language shaped, use of language changed over all of this time. All right, Tom, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, how many different types of scalability can you think of? I believe there are many. And then in addition to the scalability quality of knowledge, how many different qualities are there of knowledge aside from scalability, like its power or usefulness or ease of dissemination cost effectively? So I think asking these questions, and anybody can shout answers here, about the different qualities and in the scalability quality in more depth will give more insight into knowledge.
Okay, wonderful. So I would answer it very simply. I mean, it's too large a question to take on fully. So I will put it in a very short way. The biggest idea of scalability that Sullivan talks about is in Autobiography of an Idea. He describes his entire procedure. He says he has come to regard only ideas which are universal as to be worthwhile. And he's found that there are many, many ideas. He's surprised by how many ideas can be taken from fields and then made into universal, fully scalable ideas. And working, kind of focusing attention only on those ideas as primary workhorses is the most powerful way to go. Form follows function is one of his ideas of that kind, that you can take that idea, it is fully scalable. You can apply it to any field. You can also apply it iteratively or recursively to any particular thing you are looking at. So that's a great example of kind of scalable ideas, and he's all for that. All right, so let me give a final chance for all the panelists to make any kind of concluding comments. Let's start with Rob and Sherri.
I'm gonna let, I just want to make a pitch for after our next week's break. We've got 8 new essays at the end of Kindergarten Chats. They are all essays which are no longer in a conversation between teacher and student. They are Sullivan pure, and they are Sullivan generally talking to groups of architects at the American Institute of Architects or some such group, or essays that he published. They are great ways to, some of them written before Kindergarten Chats, some after. They're great ways to flesh out some of the things he's talking about. The first 4 chapters, which will start in 2 weeks, start with characteristics and tendencies of American architecture. And then we'll read up to emotional architect as compared to intellectual architect. And that is a study he calls is a study of the subjective and objective. So we've talked about that a little bit in past chapters. So we'll get into a little bit more there.
Wonderful. I thought when you were saying that you wanted to emphasize something, I thought you were going to emphasize the point that you're not ordinary.
Oh,
okay.
I'm not ordinary.
All right, Rob.
Okay. Well, I wanted to follow up a little something because I think it's interesting that Sullivan ends on this note of optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to follow up a little bit on what some of the things Ash said earlier, which I really liked about, the case against pessimism. This is a drum I've been beating for a long time. That I used to say that I missed all the really great opportunities to be a pessimist, right? Because there's all sorts of really horrible, disastrous moments in world history you could look at where everything seemed like it was falling apart. And they're so much worse than today. So I almost feel like it'd be ashamed to look at the way things are today and say, oh, Donald Trump got elected, we're doomed. Hitler is not destroying major cities in Europe. I mean, this is not, things were much worse, they're much greater disasters in the past. But I also think I wanted to draw a point that Sullivan makes in this book that I think is really important, is in making his case for the idea of people today looking at things independently and thinking about things in their own terms. He says, do you think that man's powers existed just for those people in the past and don't exist in you today? And I think the same thing is the case for optimism too, that the man's powers, as he discusses here, are not some things that existed and allowed people to solve problems and make progress and go forward back in the distant past. But today, it's not, you can't do it. No, of course you can do it. And in fact, you have far more resources. There are far more people out there, working to solve the problems than ever before. So, man's powers, we have full access to that. Anything that's been accomplished in terms of achievement and progress in the past is fully available, and even more so to us today. And I think that's the optimism he's asking the student to embrace, is recognizing his own powers to create and to change the world. And that's something we need to recognize today as an answer to pessimism.
Wonderful. So Rupali, Joia, or Maritza, any closing thoughts?
Yes. So I'm kind of expanding a little bit on my earlier comment, but it kind of aligns with some of what Rob was saying. So there's Sullivan tells us, there's a moment in our lives when we burst our bonds or fail to burst them. But he actually answers that, because he tells us at the very beginning, when the student is despairing at learning, he says, I can never learn this. I don't have the eyes of a poet. Sullivan tells him, never fear. We are all poets. You do not see things now, but a little later on, things will begin to see you and beckon to you. So again, I say to you all, if you're standing underneath a tree, look up, and you will have a different perspective on so many things in your life. Because I really, with Louis Sullivan's readings and readings of other things that we've been tying in with some of you here and with Shikant and other meetups. You know, it's just a matter of changing our perspective. There's a Spanish saying, if you roughly translate it, it's something along the lines of, you know, if you don't like the moment in which you find yourself today, just take a moment and have some coffee and then look again. And it's like it's a hard translation, but it's something along those lines of just, you know, if you don't like where you are right now, just shift a little and look again. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Maritza. And I second that sentiment. So if you're standing under a skyscraper, look up. And if you're standing on the top of the skyscraper, look around and see what amazing things are out there. Excellent. Next up is Rupali or Joia.
I would just expand. Okay, I would just expand on what everyone has said and point out that this is the best time to be a human being yet in the history of humanity, and it's only getting better from here. And to end by saying it is our time for willing. Now begin.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. And you know, this Kindergarten Chats is not written just for architects. I'm going to share what Louis Sullivan wrote to while he was writing these drafts. He also had written to different people, and in the appendix you can see one of the letters. It says, "The key to the Kindergarten Chats you will find as the development proceeds slowly but elaborately in the development of the character and artistic nature of the young man from within. I'm writing for the people, not for the architects." So this book is not just for architects. This book is for all of us to begin our own journeys. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rupali, as fitting as the end to this conversation on Kindergarten Chats. Now begin. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.